I think we can probably get started on the latest of our Institute of Business Ethics webinars. I'm David Grayson. I have the pleasure and privilege of chairing the Institute. And today we're going to be discussing an issue that is becoming more and more of a topical and urgent question for many businesses as companies are challenged to think about, do we have to not just be doing things, but also talk about what we are wanting to see changed in society, whether that's speaking out and speaking up for social justice or sustainable development in its different forms, urging governments, for example, to take tougher action on the climate emergency, or whether it's issues to do with diversity and equity and inclusion and tackling some of the challenges of hyperglobal inequalities. You may have seen a recent blog that I wrote for the Institute. It's on the IBE website, which talks about some of the drivers that are making more companies around the world think about, do we have to speak out? And what's our legitimacy in doing so? And how do we do so both effectively and ethically? The global consultancy GlobeScan did a recent survey with the Centre for Corporate Reputation in the Said Business School in Oxford, which will be, of course, well known to Shah because she was previously working with Said very actively. And in that survey, which was amongst international public affairs, corporate affairs professionals, the survey found that half of all of those corporate professionals believe that companies should be taking now a public position on major issues. And what I found particularly remarkable in that survey by GlobeScan and the Oxford Said Centre for Corporate Reputation is that 1 in 3 of those public affairs professionals said that their companies now have, and I quote, a strong appetite for corporate advocacy. And what's particularly remarkable is that that's up from just 1 in 5 when the same question was asked the previous year. So what we're going to be talking about today in our webinar is, how do companies speak up and speak out, both effectively, but also ethically? And to have this conversation, I am delighted that we're joined today by Louise Terry, who is a very experienced corporate communications professional, working with many international companies over many years. And Louise, amongst other things, is a very strong member of the board of the IBE, and I'm delighted to be working closely with Louise on the further development of the Institute. And welcoming in our guests today, Shah Shamian Love, who I have known for a good few years when she's been working with organizations like Sustainability and Volans, and now is, of course, heading global advocacy with Natura and Co, and her colleague Zoe Carton, one of the members of our International Advisory Council, Ian Anderson from Cicero, who was meant to be joining today, very unfortunately has had a family bereavement in the last few days, and so sends his apologies. And of course, we send our condolences to Ian and his family. So, Shah, when we were having a pre-webinar conversation the other day, and I was talking about my experience last week in Amsterdam attending the Be for Good Leaders Summit, where one of the whole strands of that summit was talking about company activism, you immediately pulled me out or pulled me up and said, but David, are you using activism and advocacy interchangeably too easily? So before we get into how to do this effectively, we better just clarify what it really is.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in on that because it's complicated, right? And, you know, I know we can always sort of talk about, there's lots of different definitions, and definitions are sort of relative to people's own different experiences. And I think these definitions constantly have to be fluid to some extent. But for the purposes of a discussion, I thought it would be interesting for us just to sort of make sure that when we're talking about advocacy, we have a sense of what that means. And Zoe and I can share how we, of the last year, have sort of started to define it within Natur & Co. in a new function that there wasn't a director of advocacy before I joined about a year ago, but also because I've spent a lot of time in the activist communities with this like fascination of where activism and social movements meets business. I think that there are some differences. But the first thing I did, and you know, you can love or hate it, but I've been trying to force myself to just understand ChatGPT a little bit better. I really don't know how I feel about it, but I feel like I've got to experience it to understand it a bit more to form my opinion. So this morning, while walking the dog, I decided to ask ChatGPT exactly this question. So I'll share with you what ChatGPT said, and then I'll reflect a little bit on how we're kind of defining these words at Natur & Co. So ChatGPT, I said, can you summarize the difference between activist and an advocate? And here's what ChatGPT, I'm going to read it off, it's just so we have it here. ChatGPT responded quite quickly and said, an advocate is someone who supports or promotes a particular cause or issue, often by speaking up for or defending the rights, interests, or well-being of others. Advocates work to raise awareness, educate, and influence public opinion and policy in order to bring about positive change. Now, ChatGPT goes on to say, an activist, on the other hand, is a person who takes action to bring about social and political change. Activists are often passionate about a particular cause or issue and work to raise awareness, educate others, and influence public opinion, policy. They may engage in a variety of activities, such as organizing protests, rallies or marches, lobbying government officials, or using social media to spread their message. So interesting, ChatGPT. Because ChatGPT is good at synthesizing, it also has, in summary, while both advocates and activists work towards bringing about positive change, advocates tend to focus more on education and awareness raising, while activists tend to focus more on direct action and mobilization. So now I'm going to switch back so I can see you all. So that's what ChatGPT says. Might be interesting to have a discussion about that. There's some of it that I think has got some of the gist, some of it that I probably would push back a little bit on, especially when it comes to the definition of an advocate and actually a definition of an activist. But where we got to in time spending looking at these two words and knowing that within our team, we have people with different experience on these different places, I think we would sort of say that advocacy is about identifying the things that we as a business want to take a stand on. Okay, so this is about, I think that came up in the ChatGPT. It's like, what are the things that we really care about, we really think we need to take a stand on? It's also about how we, as people within business, mobilize others and really make sure we know that there are ways to empower. Actually, I take that back. How do we make sure that the people in business understand the power that they have to use their power as a force for good? So again, it's sort of inspiring a desire in not just our little advocacy team, but everybody within the organization to think about the things that they want to take a stand on and how to take action. And lastly, and really importantly, it's about how we join forces with others, because we know these things that we're taking a stand on are not things that as an individual business, we can change alone. We must find ways to work in partnership with others. So that's kind of our advocacy definition, loose definition. When it comes to activism, I'm going to go back to a role that I had at IBE Lab UK before joining Natur & Co., which was as an activist in residence. And I did spend time talking to activists to ask them what their definition of activism was. And the definition that really resonated for me was that activism, what it's really about is like seeing your edge, like your individual edge, and seeing it, witnessing it, like saying hi to it, and then being willing to walk up to it, and then jumping over it and going beyond that edge. And the reason why I love that definition is because it's a relative term. It means that actually everyone's edge is a little bit different, and there's many different ways that that edge can be met, and there's many different ways that an activist can show up. So I think I'm going to pause there, but I'm glad you opened that with that question, David, because it's definitely something that we've been thinking a lot about, and we felt was important to internally have a view on what do we mean by advocacy and what do we mean by activism. And again, interesting to see how what we've been working on meets what ChatGPT is processing when it comes to these concepts.
Shah, thank you. I suspect that you have just got an IBE first the first person on an IBE event who has used ChatGPT to be able to introduce the topic. I suspect you're not going to be the last. Whether you are always joined by people who admit where they got their material from. We are the IBE, so it's great. Louise, before we get into how to do all of this ethically and effectively over time, rather than just for a short burst and then it disappears, does what Shah has to say resonate with you? And do you, from your perspective, see that this is something which is growing, at least for companies which are in the public eye, which are taking a leadership stance on issues like sustainability and the future of the planet and the future of just society and so on?
Yes, thank you, David. Have I unmuted myself? I think I have.
You have.
One. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this. It's a subject so close to my heart, both as a trustee of the IBE and somebody who's been in big global consumer brands, actually, for most of my career. So, and there's something I wanted to talk about first, which I think is the subject of trust. And I think that's super important because I really believe that trust is at the heart of this debate. Everything goes back to being trusted and being trustworthy, which we talk a lot about at the IB, obviously. And as we all know, trust has to be earned, it has to be nurtured, and it can be really easily damaged by getting it wrong on something like this. So like Shah, we all talked a few days ago about the difference between advocacy and activism, if you like. And I think that really is important for this, because particularly from where I come from, my perspective in big business is that I think that advocacy is super important. I see that. So my definition, which may or may not agree with ChatGPT, is that advocacy is more about having and if you like, sharing a point of view. And I think that's really essential to building trust. Activism, and I know you and I have had this discussion, David, I'm a bit more cynical about. I see it more in the context of business, that is. I see it more about campaigning. And in that way, I would sort of say probably approach with caution, because I've seen activism at its worst when it's just about making a noise about something. So, you know, there's a real risk there that it's seen as being cynical, it's insincere, it's done for sort of, you know, getting a sustainability badge or you know, actually a form of marketing. It's kind of virtue signaling, maybe. So from my perspective, from big company point of view, I'd say it's more appropriate maybe for smaller challenger brands to be activists. You know, they can perhaps get away, be a bit more superficial or short term in a way that big business just can't. So if you're a big business, you need to be really careful. And if you do adopt a cause, which is great, you need to, my advice would be check carefully that your own house is in order. You know, if you're making a position, a stand on something like Black Lives Matter, which is incredibly important, make sure your own communities are being treated equally first. You know, look at how you're treating your tree pickers in your tea pickers in Sri Lanka, or your cocoa farmers in Kenya. Or by the way, did you know that your mica in the shimmery eyeshadows is mined by children in India? You know, things like that. Be really, really careful before you wade in. But I should say I'm a huge believer in advocacy. And just to touch, if you'll tell me if I'm talking too much, but I've seen some really interesting changes, I think, in my career in this area. So getting back to your point about today, the sort of the emergence of I suppose, how we do business is a subject of scrutiny and genuine interest that back in the 90s or even 80s, dare I say, when I started my career, you know, people, that the focus was on brands and the sort of business of business, if you like, was in the background. The media might have uncovered some corporate malpractice and people like me would rush in and do a bit of crisis management, but that was about it. And for lots of very good reasons, not least the enormity of the challenges we face, businesses and business leaders are expected, even required now, to declare their values, their purpose beyond delivering shareholder value. And of course, there's a whole raft of regulatory and compliance that comes with that. But for me, I'm a huge believer that business is a force for good. I'd love to see, you know, I think business is part of the solution for the challenges we face. I'd love to see more collaboration between business working with, you know, communities, with scientists, with NGOs, with governments. So it's a really interesting area. And I would just finish with 5 brief points that for me would be really important if you're going to adopt this, which you should, what to do, how to do it. And the first is, I think it's so important that this is something that you need to invest time in as a senior leadership team to really, really think hard about your purpose as a business. So what can you as a business do to help solve the challenges we face and deliver positive impact beyond your day-to-day selling widgets, whatever it is? And the second is, how do you embed this really deeply through your organization, engage with employees, get everyone involved, so that it's a proper, deep, sincere commitment. And that involves looking at your own business activities really thoroughly before you start. So you must make sure your own activities are exemplary right the way back through supply chains. 3, obviously you'd expect me to say, you're going to have to work really hard on your communications. You've got to think about what you want to say and to whom. So, considering your audience is important, so you get the tone right. And going back to that Black Lives Matter as an example, how do you say we care externally, but making sure internally your diversity and inclusion work is a top priority. And keeping an eye on marketing teams. I mean, this is, in the companies I've worked in, this is a group of super smart, dynamic, talented people whose job is singularly focused on selling more products. And of course, they know that consumers care about these causes. So it's very tempting to adopt perhaps some of the superficial aspects of this and get into trouble. And of course, social media has massively increased that risk. So occasionally, you're going to have to rein in some of the exuberance of the marketeers while encouraging the right collaborations. And I think Unilever have done a fantastic job at managing some of that sort of tension. And finally, I would recommend that you engage. Get out of your office, find interesting organizations that are working in the field, talk to them, collaborate, and don't be afraid to say, we're not perfect, but we're working on it.
Fantastic. We'll come back, if we can, in a moment to some of the building blocks for building ethically and effective advocacy in organizations. And I'm really fascinated by the Natura & Co story, which hopefully we'll ask Zoe in just one moment and Shah to take us through. But can I just remind everyone, we're hoping this is going to be more of a round table, a conversation. So if you have got points of view as well as questions, please do post them in the Q&A box, even if it is a comment, because we use the chat facility just for technical queries and inquiries, and we're monitoring from the discussion viewpoint the Q&A app, part of the app. So apologies if that's causing any confusion, but please do post there. Zoe and then Shah, you've been building up over the last year plus the Natura & Co advocacy. Shah said earlier this was an entirely new function of things. What's been your experience in building something up from the beginnings?
Yeah, absolutely. Delighted to come in here. And actually, some of the points I have are reflecting on what Louise has said. I think one thing which has been really important to us is getting really clear on the intention behind our advocacy work and using that as a guide to consider whether we're on the right track and how ethical it is to bring in the broader conversation. Because I think so often with advocacy, we focused on output. So the post on social media or, the letter we're signing. But I think coming back to the intention is really important, because if your intention is that you want to use your influence and your platform as a business to make the world a better place, then you're on the right track. But if, as Louise said, it's for marketing reasons maybe, or it's to increase sales or whatever it is, then maybe that is cause to rethink whether your advocacy strategy is where it should be. And obviously that involves getting really honest with yourself as a team, which isn't always easy, but super important. And then I think the other reflection I'd come back to, which is something we've been super focused on as Natura & Co as we've been building our strategy, is really ensuring that we're walking the talk on what we're advocating for. So that we're taking the steps as a business within our own operations, which put us in the position to speak out externally on something. And the example I'd give is Natura, which is one of Natura & Co's for brands, does a lot of work in the Amazon and with the Amazon in the context of its own supply chain. So it sources over 40 ingredients from biodiversity in a way which not only protects the forest, but in some case even regenerates it. And because of that work they do, they are able to really authentically speak out for the Amazon and advocate for the protection of the Amazon, with the knowledge that they are internalizing that within their own operations. So those are kind of a couple of reflections on things we've been really focused on throughout the past year. And Shah, I'm sure you've got some stuff to add to that.
Shah?
Well, no, Zoe, you've done an amazing job, I think, of sort of setting the table, and then I think sort of building on the important points that Louise has brought in to shape the discussion. Maybe what I can do, David, is just sort of highlight, where we've gotten to with our advocacy strategy, with the basing that Zoe has shared about some of these, really guiding principles, but also how we are starting to think about these things and how they stack up. I mean, can I check with you? Would that be valuable?
Yes,
At this
please.
stage? Okay. I just don't want to go in a direction that you as chair are not interested in going in, but let me just sort of paint a little bit of the picture of where we've gotten to. I mean, number one is we realized how important it was to ground the work we're doing, again, in the conversations and the questions that Zoe's mentioned. And we kind of created a 5 A's of advocacy that, again, we could use to guide how we develop our strategy and also how we activate it. Again, Louise, to your point, the first A is authenticity. So it has to be authentic. It has to be authentic. And that links to, the origin story of the companies, where we've been, where we are right now. The thing I would also add to it, in the spirit of trust, is also the governance. And I think we're in a unique position as Natura & Co. in that we are a publicly traded company that are a B Corp, which means that we have in our online and available for anyone to view bylaws, Article 3, Paragraph 2, a very clear and explicit statement that, our organization is about considering shareholders and stakeholders, and it lists those stakeholders over both short and long term. So that is actually hardwired into our bylaws legally in our constitution. So I think
just before you rattle through all of the 5 A's, you made reference, I'm sure most people on the webinar will be familiar with the term, but you used a term that may not be familiar to everybody. You talked about the Natura & Co. origin story. So without getting into what is actually the origin story of Natura & Co., just the terminology.
Oh, do you mean, what do I mean? The story of why we were started, and really essentially what motivated our founders of Natura. And of course, within that wider family of brands includes Avon. Some people may not know this, but Avon was providing opportunities for women to have financial opportunities before they had the right to vote. So again, that is a part of the story of where Avon has been and where it is. The Body Shop, Dame Anita Roddick, I just finished her book recently, Business as Unusual. So if anyone's interested in this activism piece, Louise, that you brought up, there's some interesting reflections from Dame Anita Roddick's story. So the brands in our family all have these sort of connections to something bigger than necessarily just being a business that's fully in the business of maximizing a return to shareholders. Clearly, we're all businesses, so they are for-profit businesses, but this sense of doing something more, having a bigger purpose is across the brands in our family. Let me rapidly just go through these other principles and then very briefly summarize how that shows up from a strategy perspective. So we have authenticity, we've spoken about, we have ambition. And actually, I am going to take a moment on this one because I was at an event recently, and in the middle of the plenary of a whole room full of sustainability experts, a professor, and Professor Grayson, you know how much I have massive respect for professors, a professor, it was under Chatham House, so I can't say who, but she put up her hand in this big audience and she said, there's a reality check here. We are nowhere near bending the curve. And that curve is the curve of climate emissions, but actually you can reflect that in the polycrisis that we live in. Loss of nature, growing levels of inequality, growing levels of emissions. And it chilled me to the bone. And in that moment, I also reflected on a quote that's been sitting with me a little bit, which is, I think it's Einstein who said that the definition of insanity is to keep on doing the same thing and expect a different result. So we are in a place where we need to bend the curve because it's not being bent. And we need to find ways to do things differently, because if we're doing things the same way we've done them, they're probably insane in the context of what we need to do. So I share that in the sort of spirit of the second A, which is ambition. So how do we hold that authenticity? Absolutely. We need to be able to walk the talk, and we hold what the science is telling us, not just the physical science, but the social science is also telling us is needed, and use that as fuel to do things differently. The third A is agency. And we've already spoken about this. This, to your point, Louise, it is about engage, right? It's about recognizing actually business in itself, question mark, is it a force for good? I would actually argue that business actually is a legal entity. It's the decisions, both big and small, that are made by people in business that make it a force for good. And that's why creating the conditions for agency so that we can inspire a desire in people to take action as a collective, individually, is so important. So again, Louise, you've mentioned it, and Zoe, this was, I know, part of what you shared as well. It's this idea, how do we engage people internally so they understand, have awareness, and importantly, feel fired up to do things differently. So that's the third A. The fourth A is activism. And I feel like there could be a whole other debate that we could continue to have about what we think about activism. As I said, I think activism has a broader definition than just campaigning. I think there are many different kinds of activists. There are those that are on the front lines and campaigning, but there are also the quiet practitioners. There are also those that are focused on knowledge building or organizing. So I think there are many different ways to be an activist, and I would plug Force of Nature has a sort of 5-question quiz that you can do online to find out what kind of activist you are. And it was a really insightful process that I went through. Body Shop also has a series of archetypes of change maker. So again, I think that activism is important, because I think that's the place where we can engage also with different tactics and different people, which is in that unusual space of going into different areas. Not for all businesses, maybe, but it's a place where you can possibly stretch. The last A is allyship, because again, it's this recognition that no one's going to be able to do it alone. We have to join forces. We have to collaborate. David, it's a movement of movements, isn't it? We know that this is going to need to come together in critical mass to drive change. But the other reason why we use the language of allyship is that it is rooted from the social justice movements. And let's be clear, I'm going to assume, not being able to see everybody on this call, but knowing that everyone on this call is here with the time, with access to electricity to be able to have Wi-Fi, it means we have privilege. And actually, one of the things we need to be recognizing is, if we are in positions where we have privilege, how do we make sure that we are creating spaces to platform other voices, open up those platforms? And there are many different ways that we can talk about how allyship is going to be a critical part of how we effectively become advocates. So those are the 5 A's, David. When it comes to our strategy, we have 4 boxes, and maybe I'm going to pause after this because I'm sure there's lots more to dig into and I'm speaking way too much, but it is about building processes. So making sure we have structures in place, absolutely having a partnership management strategy that allows us to know who we're joining forces with and what we can do together that we can't do alone. It's also about internal advocacy, and I know Zoe's really taking the lead within Natura & Co. on how we're, again, inspiring a desire in people to take action and what those awareness and training programs look like. And then it's showing up in the moments that matter. And that's sort of, I think, some of the more traditional, advocacy, which is, being present and using our voice and platforms in places like COP28, COP15. So that's a bit of a summary. 5 A's, 4 boxes on our strategy. That's where we're at.
Fantastic, and we'll capture a summary of that for anyone who didn't have a chance to scribble all the 5 A's of authenticity and ambition and agency and activism and allyship down and what we're meaning. I see Catherine in the Q&A, and we are using the Q&A function, please, not confusingly the chat function, to pose points of view and raise questions and so on. And I can see that Catherine Marshall has raised a really important point about how you engage different potential internal and external allies in the whole advocacy. And I do want to pick up the fascinating examples that Natura & Co has been working on with younger people, with younger employees and so on. But before we do that, there's a really important question, at least from what I'm seeing, and it's raised by Peter Massey Cook, who asks us, is there a risk that corporate advocacy can lead to cynicism as being simply corporate PR if the company is only advocating on safe subjects that are not truly in dispute? So potentially just virtue signaling rather than showing true courage and changing attitudes. And we're obviously primarily based here in the UK, obviously Nature & Co, global business and so on. But I'm thinking, as I read that Peter question about some of the ferocious debates going on now in the United States, and some people saying that companies like BlackRock and others questioning, are they dialing down a little bit some of their advocacy around the climate emergency, around broader ESG questions, because of all of the backlash from the red states, the Republican states, some of the Republican state treasurers withdrawing their funds from businesses that they regard as being, and I quote, woke. And is there a danger that, yes, indeed, advocacy only is about the safe issues? Louise, do you want to pick up that really tough question?
Thank you, David. Yeah, that's a meaty one. I have some sympathy for that point, actually, but I suppose I was thinking while you were reading it out that there's a big issue about, or a big thought about relevance, you know, and going back to, I think Zoe mentioned the very first thought at Natura was about intention. And I think that's really important. So, you know, why? Just very simple question is to ask yourself, why do we need to advocate on this or have a point of view? Is it relevant to us? It may be relevant to the world, but do we as a business should we be involved in that debate? And to think carefully. I mean, you can't wade in on everything. There are certain topics that you will want to have a point of view on because they're important for protecting your business. So you might be lobbying about certain things. And there are certain things you should have an opinion on because they matter to all of us, which is about, you know, your impact on societies, on the environment, more than ever. And you know, I think there's also about how you go about it. So, you know, I left Coca-Cola a long time ago, but you know, I watched with interest the sort of reaction to their sponsorship of COP27, I think it was, in Dubai, and you know, there was quite a lot of backlash to that, and you know, if you just put your name on something and think that by sort of showing up you're going to get the golden glow of you know, good reputation that comes with it, I think you're wrong these days. I think you have to engage properly in topics. You have to listen. You have to be prepared to change. And I think businesses are realizing that. So, you know, when you get involved in these debates, it mustn't be superficial, I think. That's in a nutshell.
Okay, let's pick up this question of how we do engage employees, and not just younger employees, but younger employees are often amongst those people who are particularly interested to see what is the point of view of the employer that I am proposing to join and give my discretionary time and effort to. And one of the questions I had when I was taking part in the Be for Good Leaders Summit in Amsterdam a few days ago was a panel discussion or a workshop discussion around employee activism, and everyone was getting terribly positive and gung-ho about it and so on. And I said, we seem to be making the assumption that employees want to be advocates for progressive causes, for the things that all of us in the room, probably all of us or most of us on the webinar would support. But I said, what happens if you're in a company in America where your employees want to advocate in support of the NRA and want to advocate against tighter gun laws and so on? Is the company going to support their employees to be activists around that topic? And we got one or two sort of interesting debates and discussions around that. So how does a business support employees so they don't feel, oh, this is just tokenist, that we can only operate within incredibly tight timelines, and the company suppresses us as soon as we start to get ahead of the game? We've had one or two examples again from the States where employees have been pushing their companies to take a stronger, a bolder stance on the climate emergency, and to be taking tougher action inside the company itself on the issues, but also to be more vocal advocates for greater action on the climate emergency. So how has Natura & Co resolved this tension about nurturing employees, but at the same time not just giving absolute free license?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Shah mentioned it earlier, but something we've been really focused on at Natura & Co is the internal piece of our advocacy strategy. So thinking not just about how we partner with others outside the organization, but also how are we engaging the people within our own organization? And the idea is really to help them understand that as a person in business, they have power to drive change, and that's regardless of where they work in the business. It's not confined to the advocacy or even the sustainability function, but it sits across everyone: legal, finance, HR, whatever it is. And I think actually that's how you really embed sustainability and advocacy into the business, is by empowering people to use the everyday choices they have and the decisions they make to make the business a force for good. And so what we've been focusing on is thinking about how we can engage our employees in causes which are aligned with the company's sustainability vision, which everyone at the company knows well. And so we're excited by how excited people are getting about the internal advocacy. So a couple of examples. The first is we've pretty recently launched a series of Ask Me Anything sessions, which is where we invite external speakers who we work with or who we're inspired by or who we've heard are leading really important work to come and do a 45-minute session with Natura & Co, where we embody the kind of environment of there's no such thing as a silly question. And we give our people the opportunity to learn more about a topic the advocacy team is working on, or a person or an organization we're working with. It's very informal. And the idea is essentially to connect people to the work we're doing so that they can connect their own work into the causes we're taking a stand on as a business. And the second example I'll give is we piloted something called The Week at Natura & Co. So this is an experience basically made up of 3 60-minute episodes, which are designed to help people make sense of the climate crisis we're facing, but also think about how they can take action to address it. And it's a pretty intense experience. So we got people to come together in a group. We held, within the context of 1 week, hence the name, 3 60-minute video sessions followed by 3 corresponding discussions for people to share their thoughts, their emotions, how they're feeling. And we had some pretty profound comments in response to it. And a lot of people have fed back to us that they've made changes in the context of their work life and their personal life. So that's something we're thinking about running again later this year. But a really exciting moment to have people from a complete range of different functions across the business come together in a way they otherwise wouldn't have and connect on something like the climate crisis.
Zoe, thank you. And I think that hopefully starts to answer the question from Catherine Marshall about what are some of the good working practice examples of how to genuinely empower and engage employees in advocacy. So I also note the comment from one of our International Advisory Council members from the IBE, Ruth Rawling. Good morning, and Thank you for joining our discussions, Ruth. Really important point there about that sometimes advocacy can be simply about quietly engaging with governments to inform governments about some of the realities of the markets and how best to bring about effective legislation. And I think historically great example in the European Union with the work that BMW and others did on extended producer responsibility. But we've got a really important point, and delighted to see that I'm not sure whether our colleague from Uganda is actually coming into the call. Robinson Aduka is coming into the webinar today from Uganda, but certainly is from there, and is rightly making the point that we need to think also about how does the global south think about international businesses being advocates, and what is the legitimacy and the acceptability of global businesses speaking out and speaking up on issues which may be quite controversial in parts of the global south. I wonder if Shah or Louise, you've got any thoughts about this question of relevance and appropriateness of international companies being advocates in the global south on issues which may not always resonate with...
David, I had one experience that was interesting. I can't sort of talk in too much detail about it, but was helping Unilever with a project in India, which was about the ethics of selling skin lightening products. And you know, what was really interesting to me was coming at it with a whole range of my own views, and then speaking to lots of different, you know, scientists, NGOs about it. But actually, the most interesting thing of all was to realize how much of the prejudice, if you like, that's sort of involved in some of the marketing actually emanated from the communities in India themselves. And the biggest pushback to any change was from there. So that was a real challenge, really interesting, and it made me realize how you have to sort of engage with the communities you're working in first and foremost. It's very difficult to impose, and you have to understand everybody's different value sets.
I would totally agree, and I think we, as a company that actually has our mother brand Natura, is a Brazilian-based company. I mean, this is something that we are thinking about a lot, and I would just reinforce, Louise, what you just said. It's about having those links and connections at a local level, and understanding cultural context. And that's where I would just point out as well. I mean, at Natura, we have, of course, the formula scientists and all the scientists that are working on sort of the ingredients, but we also have a team of cultural anthropologists, which have roles is to really understand what's happening in the communities and some of the indigenous networks within the Amazon. So again, there's actually a range, I think, of altitudes to that question. There's the locality. We also, as a function based in the UK, Zoe and I are both here in London, but with partners and colleagues from across our brands that are in different parts of the world, we find it really important to have a regular meetup and set of conversations to make sure when we are looking at the things we're taking a stand on, we're approaching it from the different perspectives, knowing that those brands have connections and experiences. So, you know, for example, we have our colleagues who are leading on this sort of work in Brazil. And so when we do have these monthly discussions on what's kind of coming up on our advocacy radar and what are the things we are looking at taking on a stand, we do that in sort of consultation. And that's where I would go back to our strategy process, where number one is process, making sure we have a really quite clear set of questions that we're approaching, which allow us to really understand the different perspectives from when these different campaigns or initiatives that we are going to be asked to take a stand on, or that we're proactively taking a stand on, that we have that sense of alignment and we have a sense of a structure in which we can have the discussions about it with our global colleagues.
And I would add to that, always be guided by very simply trying to do the right thing, which sounds incredibly simple, but you've got the sort of, you know, marketing view on one side, you've got the kind of regulatory and compliance, and then you've just got this very simple point of the triangle, which is let's just always be focused on doing the right thing. And I think if you try and stick to that, it makes your advocacy less risky.
I'm sure that's right, and which is why I am so fascinated, given that corporate advocacy does seem to be being expected, not universally, not totally accepted by all actors or all stakeholders, but seems to be being expected by more people in more countries. Look at the Edelman Trust Barometer data and so on. If that is indeed the case, then how do organizations do it both successfully and effectively, but also linking it back to their ethical core and how they are defining what it is that they want their organization to be, so their purpose and the kind of behaviors that they are wanting in all aspects of the company's affairs, how they're expecting employees to behave, but also how the company shows up. Now,
there's a very interesting point here about investment from Lee Tel Ari. I don't know if you've seen, worth a mention that, you know, your advocacy position is one thing, but when investors or shareholders examine it, there's a lot of scrutiny now around, again, how deep it goes and how relevant it is. So I think there's a very interesting point about, again, superficiality versus very deep-seated values and how you live according to them. That's worth a mention there from the investment community and the whole rise of ESG that we should talk about.
Absolutely. Just before we do that, though, one of the things I did promise that we should discuss, and I don't want to run out of time for us to do this, and that's the whole question about engaging employees successfully and younger people. And I do think that, again, Natura & Co has got some interesting examples and learning that we should be able to explore. So Zoe, do you want to talk a little bit about how you are trying to engage younger people specifically and the youth collective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say very upfront that the work around youth engagement primarily sits in The Body Shop, which is one of Natura & Co.'s 4 brands. So we're just here to champion and share about it, but all the magic happens with them. And I think, you know, it's no secret that the decisions we take now will disproportionately affect younger generations in that they will live with the consequences for longer. And I think particularly when it comes to nature and climate, we're reaching tipping points, so boundaries beyond which if we pass them, we can't come back. And so particularly on these issues, young people really can't wait until they're older to be vocal and to speak out and to demand change. And so we're seeing the rise of young people speak out through things like protests, but also things like conscious consumption, the desire to work for ethical and sustainable companies, etc. And The Body Shop recognized that they can't ignore these young voices, nor should anyone. So they launched a global campaign last year called Be Seen, Be Heard, together with the UN. And at its core, it's designed to amplify youth voices. And it's born out of a recognition that historically younger people have faced barriers when it comes to participating in public life. And their very clear objective is to change one piece of legislation or to support initiatives which promote youth participation in all countries they operate in, which I think is over 75. So for example, in the UK, they're calling on the government to lower the voting age in UK elections to 16. And one really important point to touch on, and David, you mentioned it, is that coming back to this theme of making sure you're walking the talk on what you're speaking out about externally, is The Body Shop UK have established what they call a youth collective. And this is a group of people all under 30, a mixture of people from within The Body Shop and also from other organizations. And I think it's all B Corps. And that youth collective advises The Body Shop senior leadership team on business decisions and primarily holds them accountable to ensuring that the voices and the views of young people are factored into decision making. So they've got their external campaign, but they're also making sure that they are including young people in decisions through the very special youth collective.
And so if anyone on the webinar live or when they're watching this on record later on wants to know more about the Youth Collective, is there a website or a section of a website, or are there going to be regular progress reports? How do people keep in touch with this live experiment?
Yeah, so I'd say in short, you might be able to jump in. When it comes to the Youth Collective, that really is an internal project and not something that I've seen them promoting on their website or anything like that. It literally is for the sake of the decision-making process. So what I'd probably point people to is the Be Seen, Be Heard campaign, which probably mentions the Youth Collective, and there's a whole website dedicated to that with updates, and I think you can subscribe to updates. But Shah, please do jump in.
Yeah, no, I think you said it well. So I mean, it is an internal, so it's not something that's being, you know, necessarily shared externally. There are a few pieces, and then we can probably dig them up. I think when it launched, there was some there was an overview of who was on it and a little bit about the terms of what the purpose was. But what is available, and I think if it's okay, Zoe, I'll just sort of complement the story, because I think Be Seen, Be Heard was a campaign. The Youth Collective was sort of the walking the talk, but there was also the Boardroom 2030 session. And I think that was, I was not at Natura & Co at the time. I was with B-Lab UK, involved in the campaign, which was really encouraging businesses around the world to have a boardroom meeting as if it was in 2030. So this is maybe something practical as well for those of you on the call that are thinking this is kind of interesting, but like, what could we do and how do we start that? And what the invitation was to companies was to have a board meeting as if it was in 2030, and to think as part of the design of that board meeting, who's around the table, what's on the agenda, what are the rules that directors will have to be considering in 2030. And there's a whole stakeholder governance thing we could bring up, or what is GAP? What does going concern mean? What are fiduciary duties? How are decisions made? And we talked about ChatGPT earlier, right? But like also citizens assemblies. David, I know we've had conversations about that too, as well as where the meeting is taking place. And the reason why I want to paint that little picture is because there's a full activation kit that is out there to help support businesses who do want to host a Boardroom 2030 session, co-designed with some great partners like WBCSD, Make My Money Matter, ICAW, GARP, Global Association of Risk Professionals. So it's a real sort of coming together of a lot of different, understanding of how boards worked. Chapter 0, I'll also say, because they're great. But the reason why I want to frame this up is the Body Shop leaned into this, and they said, yeah, I think we want to do this. We're going to have a Boardroom 2030 session, but we're not going to have it closed. We're going to do it during COP26. We're going to open it up and we're going to record it. I'm not sure if they recorded the whole thing, but there is a video that if you want to see what this looks like and the challenges of the questions that some of the young activists that ended up joining that Boardroom 2030 session asked of the CEO of the Body Shop of the time and the director of sustainability and activism. It's a quick 2-3 minute video, but I think it'll give you the spirit of what those Boardroom 2030 sessions look like. And again, the Body Shop leaned into this with the view that they wanted to use their Boardroom 2030 experience as a way to see what it would look like to have all young people on the board. So how would they respond to questions on the agenda? So we probably plug the link in, but as Zoe said, the Youth Council is an internal, Youth Collective is an internal piece. But if this is sort of an interesting area that you want to explore, and maybe you want to see what other companies have done, Coots did one with their youth group. I think they had their Boardroom 2030 session at Royal Albert Hall. Go figure, like as one does. But there's some great case studies, some great examples, and I would encourage people that are interested in this conversation to check it out.
Thank you very much. That's a great resource. I've been very struck in attending a number of conferences and events in the last few months. So the wonderful Anthropy event, which the IBE was delighted to be a partner and contributor to, which was held in the Eden Project down in Cornwall last November, will be taking place again November the 1st to the 3rd this year, and we will again be actively present as the Institute there. They had a whole group of next generation younger voices taking part, emerging leaders. I was in an event in the United States back in February for GreenBiz, where again they chose a number of emerging leaders from supporter companies, both in the US and internationally, and gave them a really powerful voice and platform at that event. And certainly in the Be for Good Leaders Summit that I was talking about earlier, they had a very strong youth presence. In the Institute, this is one of the next topics that we are going to be turning to, because we are increasingly aware that the perceptions and the ideas that the next generation have about what constitutes doing business ethically may not be the same as what those of us who are baby boomers might think of as being ethical business behavior. And what constitutes being an ethical business and doing business ethically, it looks probably very, very different to the next generation. So we are about to launch our next generation project. We will be including that as part of what we hope will be our contribution in the Anthropy event in November. So if anyone on the webinar is interested in learning more, then please do make contact with the IBE staff team. If anyone would like to help with our next generation project to really track what are younger people seeing as ethical business, what are some organizations doing, whether it's Boardroom 2030 or the Youth Collective, etc., we would love to hear from you. Now, conscious that we are getting close to the end of our allotted time, first of all, I'm just quickly checking if there's anything that is really significant that we haven't already touched on in the Q&A. I don't know whether any of our panelists have been monitoring and have spotted something that they want to raise, but if not, I'd just like to explore this whole question about the fact that we're talking more nowadays about greenwashing, and more companies are being very mindful of greenwashing. Shah, you and I were at an ED event back in March when the representative from the Competition and Markets Authority was talking about the work that they're doing around greenwashing and the fact that they're doing this in discussions and collaboration with 77 different consumer protection and regulatory agencies around the world, which I thought, wow, that's a degree of interesting regulatory collaboration around that. You have some companies talking about green hushing, on the other hand, saying we're so nervous about our positions being misunderstood, or people saying we are claiming more than is legitimate, so we're going to err on the side of caution and so on, which in many respects I personally think is as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than greenwashing. And you introduced some other terms, Shah, the other day.
Definitely not my terms. Let me just be clear. These are the terms from Clover Hogan at Force of Nature, which I will give another shout out to say if you're doing next generation work, got to talk to Clover and Force of Nature because of the work they're doing. But she did write an interesting piece around greenwashing, green hushing, green rinsing, and green shifting, which is about where and how coming back to the conversation about intent and where the action is being pushed. So there's some interesting terms out there, but I would encourage people to check out Clover's blog because she goes into this in quite a bit of detail.
Fantastic. And I suspect that not only have we had our first ever kind of speech from ChatGPT on an IBE webinar, we've hopefully provided quite a lot of new detailed terms and sort of things to go and look at on today's webinar. Can we just finish though with a few sort of concluding reflections, key takeaways, key messages that if you are going to be an advocate, if you are going to become more activist as a business around sustainability and social justice, the climate emergency and so on, particularly if you're going to try and engage younger voices, next generation, what are the absolute critical things that you need to get right? Louise?
Thank you, David. Gosh, well, we've got a lot to think about from today, but I think for me, the overwhelming priority is to be honest and to communicate. It would be a great shame if fear of you know, being sort of sanctioned stops people from communicating the very good work they're doing. I think it's okay to communicate work in progress, maybe a bit of humility, actually, to say that as an organization, we want to do this, and this is what efforts we're making, and we may not get it right all the time, but we are committed to it. That's good to do.
Thank you very much. Zoe?
Yeah, for final thoughts, it's something which has come up quite a lot, but I'd probably just say, you know, appreciate that as a business, you can't have a stance on everything, you can't be vocal on everything, and if you are trying to do that, then the message is probably going to get diluted. So work out what it is that you are uniquely positioned to really make a difference on, and focus on that, and make sure you're walking the talk, as we've spoken about a lot.
Thank you. And Shah?
Yeah, I think advocacy is, to me, about systems change, and systems change is about policy and culture change. We need both. And that's why also I think we need to really sort of find a way to understand some of those activist energies, even if they make us super uncomfortable, because we are not curbing, we're not taking the edge off. We're not yet at that place where we're bending the curve, and we can't be insane. Can't do things the same way we've been doing them before. It needs to be different.
And I do think that this idea of having the uncomfortable, the difficult conversations outside of our comfort zone is so important now for businesses to be able to hear the different voices, the different perspectives, whether it's from next generation, whether it's from Global South, is a really important part of this whole dialogue. When we're thinking about advocacy, we are thinking, of course, about trying to change sometimes regulation and the whole tax regimes and subsidies and so on, in favor of net zero, in favor of long-term sustainable development, pro-nature, and so on. But we're also very often thinking about how do leading companies act as advocates to persuade other businesses in their sector, for example, through trade associations and the like. We're often thinking about how do businesses engage different stakeholders, including consumers, to change consumer behavior, as well as to change public policies, because this is going to require, if we're going to bend the curve sufficiently fast, it requires, and at all, really, it's going to require action on so many different fronts. I think this has been a really intriguing and thought-provoking, I hope, conversation today. Thank you all very much indeed for staying with the conversation. We will provide some follow-up notes for some of the exciting initiatives that we've been talking about today. But just for now, can I give a huge thank you to Zoe, to Shah from Natura & Co, and Louise Terry from the IBE board. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks for the great questions, David. Great energy and great questions from you and from the group. So thanks.
Thank you very much.